The humid air of August 7, 1944, felt heavy and suffocating as General Dietrich von Choltitz's staff car rolled down the Champs-Élysées. From the windows of his new headquarters in the opulent Hotel Muris, the view was breathtaking: the Tuileries Garden, the Louvre, the very heart of a city he had been ordered to prepare for annihilation. The 50-year-old general was a professional soldier, a product of the Prussian military aristocracy, and his career was built on obedience. Just days earlier, at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler had personally given him the command, fixing him with that unnerving stare. The Führer's instructions were laced with paranoia and fury, a clear directive that Paris was to become a festung, a fortress, to be defended to the last man. And if it could not be held, it was to be turned into a field of ruins. Choltitz, a man who prided himself on fulfilling his duty, now found himself the designated executioner of the world's most beautiful city. The weight of this terrible honor was palpable in the silence of his gilded office. Archival records paint a portrait of a man forged in the crucible of total war. Choltitz was no stranger to destruction. As a commander, he had overseen the devastating aerial bombardment of Rotterdam in 1940 and the brutal, grinding siege of Sevastopol on the Eastern Front in 1942, which left the city a wasteland. This history was precisely why Hitler chose him. He was seen as a reliable instrument of ruin. Yet, the same records, including his own post-war memoirs, reveal a critical, little-known detail. His final meeting with the Nazi high command had left him profoundly disillusioned. He saw not strategic geniuses, but a clique of sycophantic, drug-addled madmen disconnected from reality. He described Hitler as a swollen, trembling figure, his trust placed in astrology and blind rage. This personal revulsion planted a seed of doubt. Was his ultimate duty to this failing regime, or to a deeper, unwritten code of military honor and human decency? The man who arrived in Paris was not the same one who had leveled Sevastopol. Within 48 hours of his arrival, a new player entered the game, Raoul Nordling, the Swedish consul general in Paris. A skilled and persistent diplomat, Nordling had spent the war using his neutral status to negotiate on behalf of the French populace. His first meeting with Choltitz on August 9 was a masterclass in delicate diplomacy. Rather than confronting the general, Nordling approached him as a fellow statesman, appealing to his sense of reason and legacy. From declassified notes of their meetings, we see a chess match played with the city's fate as the prize. Nordling's initial gambit was not to save the city, but to secure the release of political prisoners. By granting this, Choltitz took his first small step away from the abyss. He was demonstrating a capacity for independent, humane judgment, a crack in the facade of absolute obedience. This relationship would become the central fulcrum upon which the fate of Paris would pivot, a quiet negotiation conducted in the shadow of impending chaos. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. While Choltitz and Nordling talked, the city itself was a powder keg. The French forces of the interior, FFI, the armed resistance, were growing bolder. Led by the fiery communist commander Henri Roll-Tanguy, partisans began openly skirmishing with German patrols. Their strategy was twofold: to harass the occupying force and, more importantly, to demonstrate to the approaching Allies that Paris was liberating itself, forcing Eisenhower to divert his main thrust toward the capital. Archival footage from this week shows the city's transformation: cobblestones ripped up to form barricades, tricolor flags appearing on buildings, and the crackle of Mauser rifles echoing through the boulevards. For Choltitz, this was a tactical nightmare. His garrison of 20,000 men was insufficient to both fight a street-by-street guerrilla war and simultaneously carry out a complex, citywide demolition plan. The uprising was forcing his hand, shrinking his options, and accelerating the timeline toward a final, fateful decision. On August 15, the pressure from Berlin intensified. A furious telegram arrived from German High Command, reinforcing Hitler's order: the destruction of Paris is of paramount military and political importance. The bridges over the Seine are to be prepared for demolition. In response, Choltitz summoned his chief engineer, Captain Werner Eberneck. The plans were grimly specific. Torpedoes were to be placed in the pillars of historic bridges like the Pont Neuf and Pont Alexander III. Key infrastructure, the telephone exchanges, the railway stations, the power plants, was to be wired with explosives. The Grand Opera House, the Palais Garnier, was to be rigged. Yet, in a quiet act of profound subversion, Choltitz gave Ebernack a secret counterorder. As his memoirs later confirmed, he instructed him to proceed with the preparations slowly, and crucially, not to insert the detonators. He was buying time, creating a buffer between the Führer's insane command and the irreversible act of pressing the plunger. The bombs were being laid, but for now, they were inert. The technical scale of the planned demolition was staggering. Captain Ebernack's engineers, drawing from vast Wehrmacht ordnance stockpiles, were tasked with wiring over 30 bridges and dozens of strategic locations. The primary tool was the Donnerit explosive charge, a stable and powerful compound ideal for structural demolition. For the bridges, naval mines and torpedoes, containing hundreds of kilograms of hexenite, were maneuvered into place by engineering barges under the cover of night. From classified German engineering logs, we see the meticulous planning. Notre Dame was to be spared direct charges, but the bridges surrounding Isle de la Cité were not, meaning its collapse from shockwaves was a near certainty. For Choltitz, this was more than a military order, it was a blueprint for cultural vandalism on an unprecedented scale. The quiet sabotage of his go-slow order to Ebernack was a monumental personal risk, an act of defiance hidden within the guise of diligent preparation. On August 19, the city's simmering rebellion boiled over. Henri Roll-Tanguy, his posters plastered across Paris, issued the call for a general mobilization. 2 AUX barricades. The response was electric. The FFI, armed with a motley collection of captured German arms, British-dropped Sten guns, and antiquated hunting rifles, seized control of key government buildings, most symbolically the Préfecture de Police. The tricolor flag was defiantly hoisted atop its roof, visible from Choltitz's window at the Muris. A guerrilla war erupted in earnest. The fighting was vicious and intimate, waged across narrow medieval streets and grand boulevards. For Choltitz, the situation was spiraling. His forces were now bogged down in a costly urban quagmire, fighting an enemy that melted back into the civilian population. He could not possibly suppress the uprising and execute the demolitions simultaneously. The resistance, in its desperate gamble, had created a tactical paralysis that served as the city's unlikely shield. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, General Dwight D. Eisenhower viewed the situation in Paris with immense frustration. His grand strategy, as outlined in logistical planning documents, was to bypass the capital entirely. The primary objective was the destruction of the German army and the push to the Rhine. A battle for Paris would be a bloody, time-consuming diversion, costing thousands of lives and, crucially, siphoning millions of gallons of gasoline from the Red Ball Express that was already stretched to its breaking point. However, the political reality was undeniable. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, argued passionately that to bypass Paris while its citizens were fighting and dying would be an unforgivable political and moral failure. The FFI's uprising, intended to force the issue, was working perfectly. The fate of Paris was no longer just a military objective, it was a symbol of French liberation and honor that Eisenhower could not afford to ignore. Amidst the escalating chaos, Raoul Nordling made his most audacious move. On August 20th, he shuttled between the smoldering barricades and the gilded luxury of the Hotel Muris, acting as the sole intermediary between the German general and the FFI leadership. In a series of tense negotiations, documented in his personal diaries, Nordling framed a truce. He argued to Choltitz that a temporary ceasefire would allow him to extricate his troops from unwinnable street fights and consolidate his position. To the resistance, he argued it would save civilian lives and allow them to be recognized as a legitimate fighting force. Miraculously, Choltitz agreed, signing an official ceasefire. His reasoning, analyzed through his later testimony, was complex. He sought to avoid a pointless slaughter of his own men against partisans, but more profoundly, he was creating a legitimate space for diplomacy. He was no longer just a general, he was the de facto political authority of a city on the brink, using a truce as another tool to delay Hitler's apocalyptic orders. The truce was doomed from the start. While some moderate factions of the resistance honored it, Rottangi's communist-led forces saw it as a trick. They viewed the ceasefire as a betrayal of their sacrifice and refused to lay down their arms. The fighting reignited within hours, sporadic at first, then widespread. The breakdown sent a shockwave of panic through all channels. An emissary from de Gaulle's camp, racing to Eisenhower's headquarters, delivered a stark message: Paris was on the verge of being leveled either by German demolition or a protracted, bloody battle of annihilation. The news of the failed truce was the final catalyst. On the evening of August 22, Eisenhower relented. He authorized the advance. The mission was given to the man for whom it meant everything, General Philippe Leclerc, commander of the 2nd French Armored Division. The order was given. The race to save Paris from itself, and from the Führer's rage, was on. The teleprinter in the corner of Choltitz's office began to chatter incessantly, each message from the wolf's lair growing more unhinged. Declassified German communications from August 23 revealed Hitler's descent into pure obsession. The transmissions were no longer strategic inquiries, they were fanatical demands. Then came the phone calls. Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl screamed down the line from Berlin, demanding status reports on the demolitions. The ultimate pressure came in the form of a direct, chilling question from the Führer himself, relayed through his staff, a question that would become legendary: Brennt Paris? Is Paris burning? This was no longer a strategic order, it was a personal, apocalyptic litmus test of loyalty. For Choltitz, there was no more room for ambiguity or delay. The time for his final decision had arrived. The question hung in the air, a demand for an inferno that he, alone, had the power to either unleash or prevent. As Hitler raged, General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division thundered towards the capital. The advance was a potent symbol of national resurrection. The division's primary combat vehicle was the American-made M4 Sherman tank, a testament to the industrial might of the United States. But these were not American tanks. Their crews had christened them with names evoking French pride and vengeance: Montmirail, Romilly, Champaubert. This was the steel of the New World guided by the spirit of the Old. Supporting them, and forming the main weight of the Allied push, was the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, Ivy. Their joint operation represented the combined will of the Allied command. Logistical analysis of the advance shows it was a desperate gamble, fueled by siphoned gasoline and sheer determination, a spearhead aimed not at a military objective, but at the heart of a national idea. For the French soldiers, many of whom had not seen their homeland in 4 years, every kilometer was a reclamation. The main Allied columns were still struggling against pockets of German resistance on the outskirts. The advance was too slow. As evening fell on August 24, Leclerc, anxious that Choltitz might finally break and give the demolition order, made a bold tactical decision. He authorized a small, vanguard detachment to make a mad dash into the city center. The unit chosen was the 9th Company, known as La Neuve. In a fascinating detail often lost to history, this company was composed almost entirely of veteran Spanish Republicans, hardened anti-fascists who had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War. Commanded by Captain Raymond Drawn, their half-tracks, named Guadalajara and Ebro, were a testament to a longer war against tyranny. Their mission was simple and suicidal: get to the heart of Paris and signal that the Allies had arrived, no matter the cost. It was a bluff, sending a platoon to do an army's job. Under the cover of darkness, Captain Drawn's small column navigated the treacherous, barricade-strewn streets, guided by ecstatic FFI fighters. At 9:22 p.m. on August 24, 1944, their half-tracks clattered into the square in front of the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. They were the first Allied military unit to reach the center of Paris. The effect was immediate and electric. Though the fighting still raged elsewhere, the news spread like wildfire. The great bell of Notre Dame began to peal, soon joined by a cacophony of church bells from across the city, a jubilant, citywide announcement of liberation that had been silenced for 4 years. The symbolic power of this moment cannot be overstated. From his window at the Muris, Choltitz could hear the bells. It was no longer the sound of an internal uprising, it was the sound of an entire army arriving at his doorstep. The bluff had worked. The military reality had irrevocably shifted. The ringing bells were Choltitz's moment of truth. His military justification for destroying the city, to deny it to an approaching enemy, was now utterly void. The enemy was already here. Personal testimony from his aide-de-camp describes a man transformed in those final hours, a strange calm settling over him. When the final, frantic call came from German High Command demanding to know if the demolitions had begun, Choltitz's response, as recorded in his memoirs, was one of quiet, decisive defiance. He gave them vague assurances, speaking of street fighting and tactical necessities, but he gave no order to detonate. He had severed the connection between the madman's will and the plunger. His elaborate deception, his slow walking of orders, and his secret negotiations had successfully run out the clock. The general's gambit had succeeded. Dietrich von Choltitz, the scourge of Sevastopol, chose to disobey. Paris would live. The morning of August 25th dawned on a city in the throes of liberation. As the main columns of Leclerc's 2nd Armored and the U.S. 4th Infantry Division poured into Paris, the remaining German resistance began to crumble. The focal point of the final battle became the Hotel Muris itself, Choltitz's headquarters. The tactical situation was absurd, a luxury hotel under siege. Sherman tanks positioned themselves on the Rue de Rivoli, their 75mm cannons aimed at the ornate facade. From archival combat reports, we see that French soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division, guided by hotel staff who knew the layout, stormed the building. The fighting was fierce but brief, a swirling melee in corridors lined with silk wallpaper and plush carpeting. Choltitz, having made his decision, ordered his remaining men to offer only token resistance to avoid a final, pointless bloodbath. He awaited the inevitable in his office, a general without an army, a governor without a city to rule. At approximately 2:30 p.m., a young French lieutenant named Henri Karcher, followed by his men, burst into Choltitz's office. The scene, as recounted by numerous eyewitnesses, was surreal. Choltitz stood calmly, in his full dress uniform, his decorations in place. Outside, the sounds of celebration mixed with the crackle of sporadic gunfire. Through an interpreter, he formally surrendered his command and the city of Paris. The instrument of surrender was a simple document, signed on the general's own desk. The man who had been ordered to become the city's destroyer had instead become its final, unlikely custodian. He was escorted from the hotel through a crowd of Parisians, a gauntlet of jeers and spittle, a captured enemy general who secretly held the key to their city's survival. He had fulfilled his duty, but not to the Führer. His duty, he would later argue, was to history and to civilization itself. In the immediate aftermath, an analysis of the city's infrastructure revealed the full extent of Choltitz's deception. Captain Ebernacker's engineering teams had indeed placed the explosives. Under the Pont Neuf, a massive naval mine was found, containing over 500 kilograms of explosives, enough to shatter the bridge and the surrounding riverbanks. The telephone exchange, the central nervous system of the city, was wired. Demolition charges were affixed to the supports of the Gare de Lyon. But in every critical location, the detonators were missing, or the wiring had been improperly completed. It was a citywide network of inert threats, a Potemkin demolition prepared for the eyes of Berlin. The economic and human cost of executing the plan would have been catastrophic, setting back the liberation of Europe by months and costing countless lives in the subsequent street fighting and humanitarian crisis. Choltitz's disobedience was not just a moral victory, it was a strategic gift to the Allied cause. The liberation was not without its shadows. The final purging of collaborators, the épuration sauvage, was often brutal and extrajudicial. Women accused of horizontal collaboration had their heads shaved in public squares, a humiliating and often unjust act of communal retribution. The political maneuvering between de Gaulle's Free French and the internal resistance, particularly the communists, began almost immediately, a struggle for the soul of post-war France. For Choltitz, the path was one of a prisoner of war. He was held first in Trent Park, a British prison for high-ranking German officers, where his conversations, secretly recorded by Allied intelligence, confirmed his disgust with the Nazi regime and his deliberate role in sparing Paris. These declassified recordings provide the final, irrefutable evidence of his intentions, validating the narrative he would later construct in his memoirs. Dietrich von Choltitz was released from captivity in 1947. He lived a quiet life until his death in 1966, forever defined by 10 days in August 1944. Was he a hero? A pragmatist? Or a career soldier who simply recognized a losing hand? The analysis remains complex. He was an obedient servant of a criminal regime for years, complicit in its brutality. Yet, at the final, critical moment, when given the ultimate order of cultural nihilism, he refused. His story is a powerful testament to the fact that history is not always shaped by grand armies, but sometimes by the conscience, or calculation, of a single individual. The bells of Paris that rang out on August 24th were a celebration of Allied arms and French courage, but they were also an echo of a silent, solitary decision made in a gilded hotel room, a general's gambit that saved the City of Light from being plunged into darkness.